Hello and welcome to Tonight at 8 from the RSGB. You may already know that during World War II, radio amateurs were drafted into the military specifically for their radio skills. But what was their experience like as they started to work for MI6 and the mysterious Radio Security Service, or RSS? This presentation looks at the experience of Scouser Harry Griffiths, G2DFH, and his move to the St Erth Receiving Station in Cornwall. And who better to share these experiences with us than Harry's son, Mike Griffiths. Welcome to Tonight at 8, Mike. Could you give us a quick overview of your presentation?
Okay, good evening everybody. It's good to be here. Thanks for giving up your time for a little while. My father said very little about what he did during the Second World War, other than he listened to Jerry in the Iberian Peninsula and a spy in North America, and he wrote down all these radio nets in his little black book, which he referred to as his code book. And from that, I've had the good fortune to speak to a number of now sadly deceased radio security veterans, and I've managed to write a book about it, which seems to be doing very well. But the important thing is the story is out there, and I hope tonight to just encourage you to remember what they did, the unsung heroes of MI6.
Well, we really look forward to this, Mike, and if you're watching this at home on Monday the 4th of November, then this is live, and you'll be able to ask questions or make comments on either YouTube chat or BATC messaging at any time during the presentation or straight afterwards. Please include your first name and call sign if you have one within every message. And note that you can make this video stream fill your screen on most devices, usually by double clicking on the picture or pressing the full screen button. Now it's back to Mike and listening to the enemy.
Okay, that's my father with wearing his his Royal Signals uniform, and as a corporal. But we must go back a little earlier than that, so let's get on to opening the code book and the story unfolds. Yes, I've already said that. I wrote a book from it, which was shortlisted by the Cornish Booker people. Right, here he is, Harry Griffiths. Now, as I said, he said very little about what he did during the war, but a few months before he died, quite unexpectedly in 1984, he sent me an audio tape about his early life in Liverpool. We listened to it and we thought, yeah, we know all about that, Dad. So we didn't listen to the end of it. And then unfortunately, later in the year, he died. It wasn't until a couple of years later that we actually listened to the last piece of that tape. And this is what he said. Indeed, I wonder what you would say. And I so wished we'd listened to the end of the tape. It would have made my research so much easier. So here we go, and I think I've unpicked pretty much all that he was involved in. But you never know, someone out there may know a little bit more. Okay, before the war, my father came from Liverpool, where he worked for the GPO. Many of you will know what the GPO, the General Post Office, where we think he learnt his rudimentary Morse code. But he was particularly good at it. And at some point, 1920s, he was born in 1912, late 1920s into 1930s, he got himself this, his call sign, G2DFH, which we knew as George 2 Dog Fox How. He was very good at Morse. He could easily read and send way above 30 words per minute. Not only that, could he also ask for a cup of tea when he was actually writing it. So, you know, some of you out there think, well, what's the good about that? Well, to me, I find that quite remarkable, you know. And the limiting factor, as I've written there, was the ability to write the Morse down fast enough. Okay. War approaching. In 1938, you see what I've written there. Lord Sanders was also a radio ham, so he would have contacted the Radio Society of Great Britain and found out who was living where and who was an active member. So my father would have received this letter, and at some point he was asked would he give his time to King and Country. He said yes, and so war begins, and inside his code book he had written down this. Now he was offered two positions: Caithness in Scotland or St Erth in Cornwall. He literally told us he chose Cornwall because he reasoned that the weather, whilst it was still wet, would have been warm and wet. So I'm here because of warm rain in the West Country. Okay, he arrived in St Erth in the spring of 1939 as a civilian. As far as he was concerned, working for the GPO. He was a familiar sight going on and off duty in the village, going to and fro. And he was actually, did he know who he was working for? Yeah, GPO. Was he surprised about what he was being paid? Yes, it was. The average pay during the war was about £4.50. My father was being paid somewhere in the region of £6.50. But not only that, he was being paid gross. You see, all employees of MI6 who were employing him were paid gross. So whether that is the case now, I do not know. The other factor that happened, he was in civvies until 1943. Tongues were wagging in the village, thinking, well, what's this young man still in civvies, not doing his bit for King and Country in uniform? So he was invited to join the Royal Signals, which he did, with the proviso that when at the end of hostilities, he could go back to his job as a GPO engineer. So here he is, Army number 2602893. Right, moving on. He, like a lot of the people who worked at the radio station at St Erth, he married a local girl. And my mum was very much Cornish to the core, and you'll notice there that she is spinster, and as a bachelor, he was a civil servant. Security was of paramount importance. This is the staff at the radio station, which is a little bit outside of the village. And this was taken in March 1946. Over 100 staff there. Now you may ask, well, the war finished in May 1945. Why so many staff still being employed at the station? Well, just think about it. Who was then the rising enemy once Nazism had been eliminated? Well, of course, it was the Russians. It was the early days of the Cold War, and there was a great need for our military still to listen to our enemy. This is my dad. I've adopted the same hairstyle, you will note. Right, the main work of the radio station of St Erth is this. Okay, so the Radio Security Service was top secret ultra. Very little was known about it, and to a large extent still is. Okay, they were very, very good operators at the station, and I've dug this out of the archives and from the post office archives, and I'll just blow it up. This is what the post office archives thought of their operators at St Erth. They were very good at it. They had this ability to listen to Morse where the QRM, so I know a little bit about it, was actually quite pronounced, but they could follow a message through. So obviously they were doing a good job. I would recommend this book. Oh, I should have said that at the very start. If you've got a pen and paper beside you, or if you haven't got one, get someone to bring it to you. Jot this one down. It was published in 1980s by Nigel West. It's still reckoned to be one of the best books out there to give an overview of the early setup and the work of GCHQ. GCHQ, I should add, was the successor of Bletchley Park. So I would recommend that one, having read it. All right, the main radio station site at St Erth, as I say, was about a mile outside the village. You would not have appreciated anything if you flew over it. This was taken by the RAF. My father spent a lot of his time in the intercept hut, this side just above the canteen. The guard hut is the only thing that still exists. Down in the field here, we see a DF hut where he spent a lot of hours on his own listening to the enemy. Right, okay, this is the garden generator hut. I was down there in 2013. Farmer uses it now to store bits and pieces for his farm. The next slide here shows the St Erth DF hut. This was taken by Rod McLeod, who actually was a member of the radio station at St Erth. So my father spent a lot of time in the DF hut, and to his left there, or left rather, is this little hut which was very useful at 2 o'clock in the morning. Right, moving on. Right, inside of the intercept hut. Now, little bit of information here. Each radio operator had 2 receivers, so they could listen to 2 ends of a message. So the message being picked up from a German radio operator somewhere in Europe was tuned in and picked up from there, and then the radio operator would twirl his knob dials there until he picked up the receiver of that message. Now, one of the things about this, again, if you're a ham, you will know the characteristics of your fellow radio hams and their Morse. Morse is as identifiable as a fingerprint, a retina, or even a characteristic. I was listening to something a little while back given by an ex-Radio Security Service radio operator, and he said I could tell within a few minutes that the sender of a particular message I was following, whether he was German, because the message came through very ponderous but without any mistakes. If it was Italian, the message came through all over the place, lots of mistakes. You could even see, you can imagine the shirt tails flying in the back of the Italian radio operator, lots of mistakes. And he said French were off the scale when it came to sending their messages in a clear and concise way. So 12-hour shift, be sitting there, there's a microphone there. Our next slide shows the headphone. Now the headphone on the left there would be going straight to the receiving receiver of the message coming in, and on the right there they would be listening to the response from the recipient of that message. Now there would be a preamble on the message coming in, which they would write down, and there would be a postamble from the message as received. Now, these pre and postambles were very, very important, and I'll come back to that in a moment, okay? The microphone here in the center was the radio operator would talk directly to the into the microphone, and they were being told where to look on the dials to find out what messages they should have been listening to. So the whole issue was, to me, as I say, I'm not a radio operator, seemed to be very hit and miss, but it worked very well. Okay, that's the microphone. Moving on. Oh yeah, there was an underground site, also not too far from the centre of St Erth, at Bletchley Farm. The site is there, it was made locally. Why underground? So it's kept out of sight from prying eyes if there was a German marauding plane flying over. My father spent many of an hour there as well. So that's that one. We'll move on again. The Enigma machine always sent its messages in a 5-digit format. I'm not going to go into the intricacies of the Enigma machine. I know a little bit about it, but not enough to make any sense. It's worth reading just below what I put there. We owe so much to the Polish cryptologist Marian Rajowski and his team. Right, moving on. Now I'm going to play a bit of Morse. What I've been told about this Morse was it was given to me by the late Bob King, who worked at the Radio Security Service, and he was initially based at Arkleyville, which is not too far away from Bletchley, and it was used as a training bit of Morse. It was recorded from a German radio operator somewhere in Europe. I want you to listen. I'll play about 30 seconds of it. What's interesting from my perspective is you get a clear bit of Morse to begin with, and then the QRM comes in and some. But I live down here in Devon, and I had the good fortune of a local radio operator who's he's gone through it, and he's given me his interpretation of it. Some of you out there may disagree with him, but it seems to fit to me. So I'm now going to play it. Oh, the other thing, incidentally, they sometimes wrote what they'd picked up on an RSS log, but oftentimes they sent it by teleprinter. But you note here is in a 5-digit format. So here we go. Oh no, actually we'll do this first. We're in France, early 1940s. This is General Heinz Guderian sending a message. This chap here is writing the message down. He's giving it to this chap who has got the Enigma machine. So whatever he's told him, he's written it down. He gives it to the Enigma messenger, who then types it out. If you typed ABC in the Enigma machine, there's a series of lights at the back, but you wouldn't get ABC at the back. It would be a different sequence of letters. Whatever it was written down and then eventually passed to the radio operator. So whatever message needed to be conveyed across the German military, they always needed 3 operators to do that. Okay, I'm now about to play the Morse. All right, follow that. Right, you've been scribbling like mad, and some of it will have made sense to you. You will have got the preamble and possibly some of the Enigma message that's come through. This, according to a local chap, is the interpretation of what you just heard. Forget that. Right, here we go. To me, I can see 5 digits. And that's all the sense I can make of it. But it's, as I say, it was pretty genuine. And I go back to the logbook, or rather the log pages that were filled in. Okay, let's move on again to my father's code book. He had quite a very clean and meticulous hand. What's interesting, St Erth in the West Country, if you've ever been to it, is not too far from Penzance. So my father was listening to German radio operators across the whole of Europe: Poland, Bordeaux, Paris, Belgium, Switzerland, Holland, and Norway, and they were all sending messages back into Berlin. Also, what's been pointed out to me by a ham is that if you say that in the Polish site they've picked up there, you've got A and B, so there are 2 operators there sending messages. And my father was able to pick up the differentiation of the radio operators there, which to me is incredible. They all, as I said, they all go back to Berlin. Moving on again, this is one of the walls of Bletchley Park. All these messages were sent back to Bletchley. And those little white squares represent different areas of the German war machine. And the little white pieces there of paper would have been unsolved messages, but nevertheless, they were starting to fit into an overall pattern. At the end of the war, the German officers were incarcerated in South Wales and interrogated it. They were absolutely astounded the amount of information that the Allies knew about the German war machine, all down really thanks to Bletchley Park. If you go to Bletchley Park, I'm not sure you can see that wall now. But anyway, moving on. So a very, very secret establishment. I'll skip through this, but it's Cornwall. It's a village. Okay, this lady, Mary Kerner, who was a family friend, I asked her a few years ago before she died, did they know, the village know what was going on at the radio station? To which she replied, of course we knew. We knew they were listening to Jerry. And apparently she spent many a time in the DF hut talking to the operators. Now, just think about it. It's ultra, it's the secret of secrets of the nation, and you've got a civilian sitting in the hut, and in their Cornish ways, saying, have a bit of chat. Right, okay. Now, no secrets in the Cornish village. This sort of, from the village perspective, is how much they knew about that, what was going on at the radio station. They couldn't all live in the village because there were so many of them. And that was, a lot of them married local girls. And sat in the DF hut. That was my family friend. I spoke to the farmer's son. He knew the configuration totally of the masts. Football and cricket were played with them. The home guard took turns with the regulars. And radio sets owned by local benefited from station technological expertise, not to mention spares. Spares were in short supply. During the war, you could keep your receiver, but you weren't allowed to have a transmitter. But if you had a receiver, parts were hard to come by. But farmers and local people grew a lot of fruit and veg. So there was a black market going on. So they could actually trade a new valve for a whole bag of potatoes. Right, moving on. Here we have the whole Y set up across the British military. Okay, so you can see primarily the St Erth radio station was tasked with listening to the German Secret Service, the Abwehr. And they were one of 6 such stations across the nation. Here we go. And St Erth, geographically, was the most southwesterly of all those stations. Bletchley Park, I expect some of you listening tonight will have been to Bletchley Park. It's quite an amazing place to go. I've been there a couple of times. And this is what Winston Churchill thought of the place. This was taken a few years back of a reunion at Bletchley, predominantly women. There are a few men at the back, but predominantly women. Interesting little background to that is in the early days of the war, there was a need of linguists, people who were good at crosswords, crosswords and that sort of thing. And they initially went on recommendations from people who used to attend private schools. But as the war progressed, they ran out of recruits, if you like, from private schools. So they got anybody who was particularly good at crosswords. And as they say, a jigsaw, not jigsaws, I will insist on saying jigsaws, but people of that nature. And they were extremely good at it. I've recently read this book, worth buying, jot it down, worth buying, Women in Intelligence. An incredible story which has hitherto not been told, and very well told by Helen Fry, okay? Women in Intelligence. Right, moving on. I gave a talk to the veterans at Bletchley Park back in 2014, and here I am in conversation with a veteran, Bob Painter. Now, Bob was an electrical apprentice at Bletchley in the 1940s, And he met Alan Turing a good many times. Alan Turing would come into his workshop and give him a basic little drawing and said, right, can you make that for me, please? It would have been a series of resistors and valves and switches and that sort of thing. Now, Bob did that. He would pass it back to Alan Turing, who went scuttling off to do what he did. Now, what Bob did say, which was quite interesting, was that most of the German capital ships had a Gestapo officer aboard. Now, the Gestapo officers were there primarily to ensure the captain of the boat did as he was told. And each day the Gestapo officer or radio operator would send a message back to Berlin to assure them that whatever the boat was, the Grasspee or the Bismarck or the Tirpitz, were doing what they were supposed to do. Now, one of the things about the Morse being sent by the Gestapo was it was very easy to break the code. Bletchley Park, very early on in the war, were able to decipher what they were saying, primarily because they would insist on starting their messages oft times by saying Heil Hitler. So they would start the message and they'd end the message by Heil Hitler. They would also do a lot of swearing. And so what was interesting is the girls of Bletchley, there they are, would have crib boards before them to enable them to come up with a solution to a hitherto bit of Morse that nobody knew anything about. So they were quite proficient with German swear words. But it worked. You know, cribs were oft times the route through to resolving a conundrum of German messages. Right, moving back to Bob. Now, as I say, he had a time of Alan Turing. So I'll move on to the next bit of there. Alan Turing, as you well know, if you've been to Bletchley, you will know he's much feted. He figures quite strongly in the story of Bletchley. However, let's just show you this. He put much of his work down on a little book, which is known as the Prof's book, which was only declassified in relatively recent times. I'm going to move something away from me so I can see that. Right, okay. Yes, it was only declassified in November 2005. But if you look at it close up, you'll notice some of the text there has been redacted. So not all is yet known about what he actually came to devise in his first attempt at a computer. Now, if you've seen The Imitation Game, you will know that Benedict Cumberbatch played the part of Alan Turing. The only problem with the film, very atmospheric, but of course they arrested Alan Turing in the film because being a Russian spy, which is a load of bunkum. He was arrested because of his homosexual activities. Now, we've got Turing on the map very much, but I wonder how many of you folks listening to this presentation know much about Gordon Welshman. Gordon Welshman was of equal stature in the world of being a mathematician. What Alan Turing came up with in terms of an early computer called the bomb, B-O-M-B-E, and he only got head start from that because of Marian Rejewski, the Polish cryptologist. Alan Turing, Gordon Welshman, fine-tuned that, and it became known as the Turing-Welshman bomb. And it was quite a very effective machine. I had the good fortune, I must tell you this a little bit about Alan Turing, Gordon Welshman as well. Remember, I went back to say, oftentimes they couldn't solve a message coming through, but they would analyse the preamble and the postamble. Well, that was the world of Gordon Welshman. He worked on that very much and was able to start to build a program of particular transmitters in Europe and where they were being moved and what regiment they were associated with. So he built up something called traffic analysis. And you see I've got on screen Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was found by the American intelligence organization working on the same setup or or the same theory that Gordon Welshman came up with, traffic analysis, and they were able to find him and ultimately kill him. Now, we're all subject to that. Being a Cornishman, of course, I couldn't resist putting a bit of cream as an example. If you go to any store up and down the country, you buy anything and you use your card, then the company computer will analyze your shopping brief. If you haven't bought what you bought last week, this week, they will analyze your traffic, and there will be a little enticement will come out of the till to say, if you buy the carrots you didn't buy today that you did last week, next week they'll be 10p cheaper, because they're analyzing your traffic. The only way you can duck that, of course, is to pay by cash, so be warned. Oh, I had the good fortune of meeting Gordon Welshman's daughter, Susanna Griffith. She lives not a million miles away from where I live, and I spoke to her about the relationship between Alan Turing and her father. There's her father and there's Alan Turing. She said it didn't go very well to begin with. They didn't get on very well at all, because they were both ardent mathematicians, very, very, what's the word I can say? Very, very into the world, how things should be done. But as the war progressed, they started to get on very well, and they worked to good effect. I will recommend this book, written by Gordon Welshman, The Hut 6 Story. It's a fabulous book in terms of unraveling what he did at Hut 6. Much of the groundbreaking work in decrypting work came about in Hut 6. At the end of the war, Gordon Welshman wanted to produce that, but unfortunately the British authorities say no way, so he went to America and he published it then. You won't get it, you may get it in Waterstones, but you'll have to go on the internet to buy it. But the Hut 6 story is very well recommended. Right, while we're still in Bletchley, Tommy Harold Flowers. I mean, this man is an absolute genius. He produced the first programmable electronic computer by using he was a basic GPO engineer, and he made it from just, well, I'm going to say bells and whistles. He made it by just using valves and resistors. And if you've ever been to Bletchley and you go to the National Computer Museum, I'll come back to that in a moment, then you'll see the result of his efforts. Well, he was very active up until, well, not up until D-Day, but he was very active around D-Day, and he was able to be involved in the deciphering of the double agents, listening to the idea that the Allies were going to invade very shortly across the Pas-de-Calais, and Hitler bought it through the deception plan, when in fact they were going to land in Normandy. So having been in receipt of what Hitler was pretty much involved in, and thinking, yeah, they're coming across the Pas-de-Calais, he then went in and saw Eisenhower and said, right, this is what's going to happen. Hitler's fallen for the ruse. And Eisenhower, okay, and utter these immortal words, we go tomorrow. So that was the 5th of January. Excuse me, I'll just have a look. Tommy Flowers, very, very little has been made of what he did, but it was phenomenal. The other galling thing for him must have been, he was subject to the Official Secrets Act. The Americans stole the march and started producing computers post-war and got all the accolade and all the trade, if you like, in this area, and he could not say anything. Right, here we are, Colossus. If you haven't been to the Computer Museum, you've got to get there. Look at those rows and rows of valves and belts. Absolutely phenomenal. Worth a visit, without a question. Right, just finishing off a little bit from Bletchley, Bill Tutt. Now, Hitler used to talk to his generals, not through the Enigma machine, but through the Lorenz machine. He sat down, and it took him several months to work out a machine that could read these messages coming through. So mathematically, he produced a machine. I mean, quite staggering. But do we hear much about him? No, we don't. So it's worth digging out a book on him. And this is the Lorenz cipher, a major cipher system. I think it was further developed into the X machine that the British military used post-war. Okay, so just coming back to St Erth for the moment, here are the areas that St Erth were very much listening to. So you can see it's quite a wide area of involvement. All right, the Abwehr. The Abwehr was headed up by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. It was very lax in radio discipline, and so Bletchley, as I've written there, were able to solve from very early on in the war what they were about, what they believed in, what they were sending on to Hitler. You must also recognize, when we get to the double agents in the moment, it was the Abwehr that were, as far as they were concerned, were orchestrating all the information that was coming from the double agents. However, as is the case in all issues of the Second World War, I think it was Churchill who said the first casualty of war was truth. Well, there's wheels within wheels, because he had a mistress. Did Wilhelm Canaris, here she is, Helena Szymanski. I've read various accounts of this. Some say not so, a lot say yes. What I have found out, and I've been doing this for 10 years, is I'm giving you this presentation today, but there's still yet more to come out of the whole issue of MI5, MI6, Bletchley Park, GCHQ. But will we hear about it? I doubt it. Right, moving on. Here we are, the Abwehr were HQ near Hamburg, where they listened primarily to the British-American radio operators. Waldorf, where the radio operators worked in shifts, so that was their equivalent to what was happening at St Erth. Now we come on to the double cross system. John Cecil Masterman, a phenomenally successful system. It's quite staggering, the stories revolved around. You couldn't make it up. I will recommend this book, written by Masterman at the end of the war. He wanted to publish it, but like Gordon Welshman, the British wouldn't allow him to do it, so he went to the States and published it. You won't get it in Waterstones or anything like that. You again have got to go online to get a copy, but it's well worth reading. It's full of page turning. My goodness me, I never thought of that. Here he is, right over the page. Double agents. Okay, a page from my father's codebook. On the left there, you see a lot of call signs. I should add, incidentally, which I haven't already done, is these call signs changed at midnight. But my father and his colleagues were able to track down the radio operator that, say, had the call sign of for Holland of UTG. The next day it would be something different, but the characteristic of his Morse was such they knew who he was, so that he would have a different call sign the next day. Anyway, what is important is this. Paris was in charge of a couple of double agents. The top one there is Zigzag. I'll go on to the next slide so you can see it. Was Zigzag, and the next one is Brutus. Madrid was in charge of Tricycle. Treasure was in charge, Lisbon was in charge of Treasure, and Garbo was also in charge, Lisbon was in charge of Garbo. So my father was able to tune in on to all of these. I'm just going to stay with a few of them to illustrate how remarkable they were. Okay, I should mention also Tar Robinson. He was the chap in charge of all the disinformation. He was in charge of the choreographer of the misinformation that was fed to the Germans, which, it must be said, was very well received. They sort of, everything that was passed over to them by the double agents, they believed without question. There seemed to be this thing they wanted to know. Right, moving on. Zigzag. Now, this chap was a safecracker before the war. He was always on the run from the British, and he eventually was captured by the British, and he was incarcerated in a jail in Jersey just as the time that the Germans invaded. And here he appears in my father's code book. His training call sign was the 3Fs, and he was known by the radio security chaps as the 3F man. When he actually became a full-time radio operator for the Germans, he kept his 3Fs, but he added another 2, so he was a 5F man. But they knew him. Now, here he is in Later Life. He goes on in this particular clip. He tells the story of how he was asked by the Germans. I should backtrack. I'm going too fast. I should add that when the Germans got him out of the jail in Jersey, they incarcerated him in a jail in Paris. And a couple of months later, they got to speaking to him and interrogated him. And they said, "Right, what are you doing there?" He said, "Well, I've been put in jail and they've misunderstood who I am. But I hate the British. I'd love to get back at them." So they said, "Would you spy for us?" And he said, "Of course I would." So they said, "Okay." So they taught him basic microphotography, basic Morse code, and how to blow things up, which of course he was very good at anyway. So he was flown into the British Isles, and he was parachuted out and landed in the Cambridge field, and he gave himself up. And he said to the British police, "Right, can you get me to the security people? I wish to spy for Britain." Well, you can see you can imagine what they thought about that. Anyway, they took him on, and he was quite useful. Why did they call him Zigzag? Because they were never sure whether he was one way or the other. So that's why he got the name Zigzag. Anyway, he was tasked with one particular thing, which proved to save the lives of many, many Londoners. And this was it. The doodlybugs, or the V1s, were landing into London with regularity. He was asked by his German controllers, "Can you tell us where they're landing in London, or whether or not we need to tweak the gyros to ensure it's in the right spot?" Well, he was told by his British minder to say, "Okay, we'll tell them that you're going north of London, you need to alter your gyros so it'll land more in central London." So the Germans did that accordingly. So London was saved, but of course they landed in Kent, which was good for Londoners, but not so good for people who landed in Kent. He was paid quite an amazing amount of money, £100,000, I think, or something of that order. And I'm just going to click over.
So the moment you hear an explosion in London, you note the time down, and you find out where it's landed.
Okay, so that's what he had to do, and as I say, he was paid a lot. Incidentally, the money he was paid was counterfeit, so he didn't get anything anyway. So moving on, excellent book by Eddie Chapman by Ben McIntyre. You can actually still get this in Waterstones. I saw it earlier this week. All right, so a good Christmas present. Okay, Agent Tricycle. Well, he was a real Jack the Lad, a playboy, a Slav. He was caught up with by the Germans, the Abwehr, in middle of Europe, They wanted him to spy for them. He said, I don't want to spy for you. They said, well, I think you ought to, because if you don't do that, then it won't go well for your family. So he said, okay, I'll spy for you. And he said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, well, our Japanese allies want to know how well prepared the Hawaiian naval base of the Americans is from attack. So we want you to get to America and find out what it is like there. So he said, okay. So he got himself to Lisbon, and then he got himself then from Lisbon to the UK. He said what he wanted to do, but the Germans wanted him to do, but I don't want to do that, he said. I want to spy for the Allies. So they said, okay, we'll get you to America. So they flew him to America, and he met this chap. Now, J. Edgar Hoover took an instant dislike to him. He hated anything because he was the other end of the character that J. Edgar Hoover was. So he disliked Popoff from the very offset. So he ignored everything he said. So on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. And from that, the Americans entered the Second World War. And it was all down to old Popoff. Now, he was quite a character, as I say. He was one for Wine, Women and Song. And he was viewed very much by this chap, by Ian Fleming. Now, Ian Fleming was involved in naval intelligence. So much of what was going on with the double agents, Ian Fleming would have been privy to. So it is thought that Ian Fleming based Popoff, James Bond was based on Popoff. And why was he called Tricycle? Well, he used to get very cold at night, or he had two agents to help him. I'll leave you to work out that. Right, moving on to another agent. I won't spend very long for this. I'm conscious of the clock. I mean, Juan Pujol Garcia. He's got to be the most amazing double agent of the Second World War. He got himself to the UK. He hated anything to do with Nazism. And eventually he persuaded the British in Madrid to get him to the British embassy in Madrid to get him to the UK because he wanted to spy for the British. Meanwhile, when he went to the German embassy in Madrid, they said, yeah, fine, no problem. You know, we haven't got a problem with this whatsoever. So he ended up in the UK anyway, and the Germans had their minder for him based in Lisbon, and Garcia had a minder in the UK, and he started to send oceans and oceans of messages to his German controller, and they believed all of it. And he had somewhere in the order of 29 sub-agents. Well, they were all fictitious. Hence, he was called Garbo after the film actress. He played the part, and he said, yeah, they're up in Glasgow, or they're in the southwest, and the British are doing this, and they're doing that. And they believed him. And it is pretty much certain that his misinformation led Hitler to believe that the Allies were coming across at the Pas de Calais. I mean, amazing story. I would recommend this book without question. Need to jot that one down. Very, very good. Quite amazing chap, but he had a very minor gong at the end of the war. Right. Oh, I've got to jot this one in because it's an amazing story. Do you remember earlier on I said my father knew of an American German spy? Well, this is based on the fact that you can see on this net that Dad had in his book that this particular American was sending messages over to Lubeck, and then he, having sent his traffic, he then worked under the amateur call sign of W2MXB. Well, Dad knew the W2MXB from before the war. So he thought, well, hang on a minute, why is this chap now appearing in the war, if you like, sending these messages to Lubeck? So he sent this information on to the authorities. He wasn't the first one to find out anything about this chap, but he was able to add something to it. So this was marked under Group 10, which hitherto was a very, from the archivists and the activists, the veterans, they didn't know what it was. But it was all about the American setup and what I've called the FBI net. It involved a lot of activities that side of the water. And it was all around this chap, William Siebold. I recommend you Google William Siebold and find out all about him. There's a particularly good book out about him, written by an author called Peter Duffy. And because of his work, a lot of German stroke American spies were rounded up. And here they are. And it still is, it was, and it still is the largest single capture of double agents against America ever for the US. And typical of the Americans, they produced a film in 1945, The House of 92nd Street, which is, vaguely follows through. And my father was in the middle of that, if you like, in tracking the messages coming from Europe, from the United States to Europe. A couple of years back, I was able to track down W2MXB with the help of Stan Ames, who is the activist for the RSS, and it's still being used, and it's being used by his grandson. Operation Mincemeat, you will be quite familiar with that. Just read that a little bit. Now, St Erth would be very much listening to the messages being picked up by the Germans, because this attache case that was involved with the dead body floating ashore, the internals of the attache, of course, case went to Madrid, and it's not a particularly good picture, went to Madrid, and then the contents were radioed up to Berlin. And eventually Berlin decided it was true, and therefore the UK knew then from that the Germans had swallowed the whole thing about, I'll go back to that, about the fact that the Allies weren't going to go, were going to go for Greece, but of course they weren't going to Greece, they were going for Sicily. And that was a very successful operation during the war, and St Erth would have been involved in that for sure. I saw that as a young man, the man who never was, and this is a more recent one, and some of you now looking at this will say, yeah, I've seen that, and it'll probably be more factual because more information has been released from MFI into the National Archives. All right, I've already mentioned the SD and Gestapo a little bit, just to see Group 3 and Group 13 in my dad's code book. Were the group numbers given to these two areas, and this was the odious Heinrich Himmler who headed those. They were very lax and they were easy to read because of their obscenities, which I've already mentioned. Okay, enemies from within. You will know who he is. I oftentimes give this presentation to an audience, but most people don't know who he is. But of course, it's Kim Philby. And there he is, the head of the Cambridge Spies. It's worth noting on the bottom of my slide there, he would have had intimate knowledge of all of the workings of the RSS. His task as working for MI6 was to ensure there was no Russian involvement in that area, and particularly the Iberian Peninsula. So all the work that St Erth was involved in, he knew about, and he would have passed on to his Russian controllers. A Spy Amongst Friends, excellent book, again by Ben McIntyre, well worth a read, and it's also out there on BritBox. Now, another one of the Cambridge Five, Anthony Blunt, he worked for MI6. He was a more recently defrocked, if you like. Margaret Thatcher knew about him in 1979. He passed over the entire personnel of MI6. So again, my father and his organisation and my father's name would have been known to the Russians. John Cairncross, the fifth man, he didn't come out until 1990, or awareness of it didn't. Worked for the post office. The post office originated all the Y stations for the Abwehr, for the RSS. He knew all the stations. He passed all information on to his Russian minder. So again, my father's name would have cropped up. And there are two other of the Cambridge Five. This chap here, Burgess, who was born about a mile and a half from where I live, and his counterpart, Donald MacLean. If you remember a writer for the Daily Express called Chapman Pincher, he wrote a book called Treachery, and I've sort of simplified his narrative, but he put this down, and he called it Secrets by the Bagful. The Russians were astounded by the sheer volume of the information being passed on by the Five. Industrial is the word you can think of. Crown Jewels, Nigel West, an excellent book. If you remember a chap called Mikhail Gorbachev during the period of Perestroika, when Russia was supposedly going to be our friend, and the vaults of the KGB were opened. Well, from that, Nigel West wrote this book in collaboration with Oleg, forgive my pronunciation, Tazarova, probably got it wrong. Anyway, what's interesting in that book is the entire organisation of the Radio Security Service was itemised in that book. And so the Russians again knew my father and his organisation. This is an interesting little pitch here. The Yalta Conference, the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, dividing up Europe. You can see Churchill looking across at both Roosevelt and Stalin thinking, they haven't got a clue. Well, I know they know nothing about Bletchley. Well, of course, Roosevelt knew a little bit about Bletchley, but perhaps not all. But of course, Joe Stalin had the biggest smile, because whilst there was three there, Joe Stalin had help from other people. There's Cairncross, there's Philby, there's Blunt, there's Burgess and MacLean. So there's a lot more people in that picture. No wonder he had the biggest smile. All right, Harry post-war. He went back to his world of ham radio. Here is his logbook, which I know all you hams out there keep meticulously up to date. And you will note here that he started back in the world of ham radio on the 25th of December 1946. Now, just a couple little pickups there from Russian agents. No, from Russian hams, I should say. Nothing to be concerned about. And a lot of these people would have been accomplished radio hams because of the war. But just the two Russians. Move on a bit to, this is August 1970. He was continually plagued by Iron Curtain operators, asking him who he was, where he lived, what he did for a living. So my father was bidden, because he was still working, but he was working for the Air Ministry by then, but he was bidden to tell them what he did as a hobby, and particularly as a radio ham. So Naval Intelligence would frequently visit our home to inspect his logbook. And they used to say, well, just humour them, Harry, tell them anything. you don't have to worry about it. But what was interesting, he was played time and time again. And why was he played? Because they all knew him. They all told the Russian counterparts about him. Right, post-war. Dad was then posted, once the radio station started demobbing at St Erth, he went down to RAF Pendeen, continuing his role as a radio operator. The Cold War was gathering pace. And in 1964, the radio station at St Erth closed. And in the later 60s, the GCHQ at Morwenstow, Bude, opened up. I've mentioned down the bottom an integral part of the Five Eyes group of countries. Here we have the Five Eyes. They came into being in the late 40s and into the mid 60s. The highest level of intelligence is shared by these five nations. There's also, here are the CEOs, a very rare photograph of the five people in charge of the Five Eyes in their respective countries gathered for a powwow. I think it was somewhere in San Francisco or that area. A very unusual photograph. Our chap is there. There he is. Right, moving on a little bit more. There is also some other levels of intelligence. There's the Nine Eyes, as you can see, Denmark, France and Netherlands have joined that, and Norway. That's a lesser level of intelligence, but nevertheless still very useful. And then you've got the 14 Eyes, where Belgium, Spain, Germany and Sweden and Italy have joined. So it's quite an exclusive club. Cheltenham has got to be expanded. There's not enough room. Quite simply not enough room. I had a good friend who used to work there. She was a linguist. Right, George Osborne in 2017, despite austerity, was able to get enough money to build this imposing building in Victoria and London, and run by GCHQ. Unquestionably, it's the front line of the world we now live in. So if you've got one of these, be wary what you say, do, or post. That's all I can say. That's all I can say. Okay, this is typical. Any of the nationals, any week will go by, and there's a good reason to be worried about what's going on with our enemies or potential enemies. Right, never a true word spoken. Right, the next couple of slides now is really a summation of the work my father was involved in post-war.
Well, Mike, it's almost impossible to follow that, so I won't try to. But just to let everybody at home know that if you've been following along and you've got any questions or comments that you'd like to share and you haven't done so already, then please do so now on either YouTube chat or BATC messaging. And please don't forget to include your first name and your call sign as well, if you have one. So, Mike, what a story. We've got a few comments and questions already come in, and I'll start with Chris Godfrey, who's M7GPW and from near Bath. I'm learning CW as I'm a World War II fan, he says. It's been okay, but not impossible. Thanks very much for your presentation. He also says there's a bronze memorial of Tommy Flowers at our BT Research establishment in Industrial Park at Martlesham, and also a memorial for Bill Tutt. Is that Tutt, I think, isn't it?
Yes, Tutt, yeah.
And he said that Bill was a Canadian. So
yeah. Thank you for that.
Rich M7KTG says, I loved reading this book. That's your book, and we'll show a picture of that in a moment. Thank you very much for putting all this together and for sharing your father's life. This must be lovely for you as well, as a kind of living memorial for your father and his work in the war.
Thank you. Yes, it is. It's quite amazing.
We will show you that book now, actually. Just to let everybody know, we did. You did show it briefly at the beginning. Here it is. And this is available, just about £15, a little bit less as well if you're an RSGB member. And you can buy that at rsgb.org/shop. It's called Listening to the Enemy. Lots of people with lots of comments for you. Mike saying, absolutely fascinating, great talk, and things like that. Nobody really ever sharing anything anything else. If you've got anything to share, though, please do it now on the BATC messaging or YouTube chat as well. I'm trying to see anything else that really, except for people saying, I'll quote some of the things that people are saying. Was not expecting this, great, absolutely brilliant, that was brilliant, fascinating talk, thank you, and lots of people saying things like that. One thing I was taken with earlier on in your talk is that when you mentioned Morse, and I must admit I'm one of the amateurs who doesn't do Morse very much really, to my shame, but it strikes me as someone who maybe doesn't know much about it that it must be hard to tell an accent, for example, a German accent from Morse, but yet you said they could identify it because of the style of the Morse. Have you got any other thoughts on that?
No, other than my father was quite good. He would say, I know who that is. And this particular veteran, I'll try and dig it out and I'll pass it on to you, David, and so you can share it. He was quite ecstatic about it. He said you would never believe it until you heard it, that you could be able to pick that up in the myriad of other noises you could hear. QRM, as you'll know, is the only thing I've really picked up. But they would know instantly who it was. Instantly.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know.
Extraordinary. Maybe, excuse me, I don't know if that's the cadence of it, maybe the rhythm of the Morse or something like that maybe gives it a unique style. I must consult with some of my local Morse fans, of which there are a lot, like Roger Cook and Jim Bacon and people like that who do Morse, and they probably could tell me they could identify who someone was just from the style of their Morse code. The other thing, you've mentioned Bletchley Park obviously several times in your talk, not surprisingly, but I'm sure most people watching will have heard of Bletchley Park. It is worth mentioning that if you're an RSGB member, you can go and visit Bletchley Park completely for free. You just need to download a voucher from the website, sign in, download a voucher and go there. And of course the National Radio Centre, which the RSGB runs there, is also another great place to see where radio and wireless fits in with the World War, and also generally as the communications that we use now and as a hobby indeed. Ken Taylor has just said a lot of Morse is computer generated these days, so less chance of identifying the operator, which is very good point, Ken. Thank you for that. I think Steve Mole says amazing that some of the information is still redacted, obviously still relevant to some. I've got a name here, I'm afraid. His YouTube name is Maconeboard. But he or she asks, with end-to-end encryption, is there any point to intercepting these days? Do you have any viewers on that with modern technology? You've mentioned several things like the mobile phone and things. I guess he's asking, with the encryption that's supposed to be in all of these things, what's your view on that?
Well, like many of the folk listening tonight, you're probably on WhatsApp, and we're led to believe that WhatsApp is so watertight, if you like, nobody can read it, but I don't believe that for a minute. I can't imagine places like GCHQ and the complexity and the development of AI and the whole business they're in now are unable to pick their way through that one and undo that one. I think everything we say and do, if we use that, the only way around it is to use carrier pigeon, I sort of imagine, if you want to convey a message and you don't want anybody to know. I think it's readable. The phone, I'm also told that the phone is always listening. My children tell me that oft times if they're in a situation and they talk on a particular subject, then a few days later an unbidden pop-up will arrive on their phone in the area and the subject they had been discussing a few days ago, and yet they've not researched it, they've not gone trawling around to find out more information. And I did also read that GCHQ and that sort of area have got the ability to, as I say, listen, but also to photograph and lift anything that you've got in your phone.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true. I certainly think a lot of phones and other devices like smart speakers and things will listen to you, because that technology is with us now, voice recognition, isn't it? And I think if you delve deep into your phone settings and permissions, you probably can stop it doing that.
Yes, probably you're right. I agree.
But nevertheless, yeah, as you say, where is all that data going and where's it all being collected?
Yeah, I think if you're only passing on family business, like don't forget to feed the cat, they're not interested in you. But if you've got other areas that you keep commenting on, you know, my background, am I being listened to? Probably, because before I went into teaching, I was in the dockyard and I was a project manager on nuclear submarines. So I have no doubt, and so did my brothers and my father, obviously, and my sister was married to a sailor. So I have no doubt that we've got a fingerprint in the intelligence organisation.
I'd hope that many of the people watching this will be radio amateurs, which means most of us are interested in the technology as well. So I guess we may be better prepared than some others to, you know, realising what technology can really do these days. Bill GM4UBJ says normally the gaps between words or the length of the dashes and the dots, especially when they're hand sent, that could give an idea of who somebody is, to give an identity of that. Union 310, again, I'm sorry I don't have a name. The book would form a very good part of a history lesson for schools.
Thank you.
And we also, there's John MI6NJZ said that his father was a VI, a voluntary interceptor, and moved into the RSS. So there are many people who know quite a lot about this, but I think we've all learned a great deal from your talk tonight, and of course your book, which is available from the RSGB shop. So thank you very much indeed for Mike for sharing this story tonight about your father. It's given us a real insight into what it was like in those days and how important a role that people like that played.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike.
If anybody else wants any more information, then do contact yourself, David, and email me.
We'll be sure to. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we'll be sure to forward any queries on. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much again to Mike. That does conclude this webinar, and thanks to Mike Griffiths for tonight's presentation and to the RSGB team who helped put this series together behind the scenes. We hope you've enjoyed this Tonight Today and that you'll be able to join us next time when Tim Heyer, G5TM, will be here to talk about basic modelling and antennas for portable HF. And if you'd like to see details of future webinars or watch recordings of previous programmes in this series, please visit us at rsgb.org/webinars, where you can also send us comments and feedback. Now, whether you attended the RSGB convention in person last month, watched online, or maybe weren't able to catch any of it over that weekend, don't forget that 2 live streams are still available for everyone to watch on the RSGB YouTube channel. The RSGB Comms team has also released 2 presentations, as well as a short video called The Convention in a Nutshell, so there's a great deal of content to enjoy. Why not subscribe to the RSGB's YouTube channel to ensure that you don't miss out on other presentations as they're released. But thanks for joining us this evening, and until next time, this is David G7ERP signing off and clear. Bye-bye.